Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The night drapes itself over the silent empires, where influence grows in whispers and entire cities can shift under the quiet rule of one man. Tonight, we turn our attention to Big Jim Colosimo, the early king of Chicago's underworld, a man whose charm, wealth, and quiet command laid the foundation for an empire that would outlive him. His power didn't roar. It moved slowly, steadily through backrooms, negotiations, and the soft glow of his lavish cafes. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now, lean back, breathe easy, and let the story of Big Jim Colosimo guide you deeper into the quiet. On a damp evening in May of 1920, the lamps along South Wabash Avenue shone on wet pavement like dull coins scattered in the dark. Inside Colosimo's cafe, chandeliers glowed over polished wood, white tablecloths, and the low murmur of early diners. The place smelled of roasted meat, tobacco, and expensive perfume, a world carefully built to make visitors forget the alleys outside. In the hallway near the kitchen, Giovanni Jim Colosimo walked with the slow, rolling step of a man who had never needed to hurry for anyone. His tailor-made suit strained a little over his stomach. Diamonds glittered at his cuffs and on his fingers, tiny points of light that showed how far he believed he'd climbed from the rocky fields of southern Italy. The staff watched him pass. Some nodded respectfully, some looked away. Everyone in that building knew the stories. The brothels, the gambling rooms, the payoffs to policemen and aldermen, the fear he inspired on streets where his name could end an argument. To customers, he was the smiling host who might stop by a table and send over a bottle. To people who worked for him, he represented safety and danger at the same time. He pushed open a door at the back, heading toward a little cloakroom where, he'd been told, a deliveryman was waiting. The restaurant hummed behind him, clinking glasses, a laugh too loud, the band tuning up. In a moment, all of that would be frozen in memory. Later, newspapers would talk about Chicago gang warfare, about jealousy, about betrayal, about the coming age of bootleg liquor. They would name suspects and hint at conspiracies, but nobody would ever be convicted. Before that shot rang out in the dim hallway, before his diamonds were laid out in a funeral home window for crowds to gawk at, he had been a boy in a village between hills and sky, with nothing but stones under his feet and hunger in his stomach. To understand how he came to that hallway on Wabash, you have to go back to that village, to the dusty road that led a teenager named Giovanni away from home and toward America. He was born in 1,878 inches, the region of Calabria, in a place where the earth was hard and work never stopped. His family were peasants, laborers tied to stubborn soil. Winters were lean, summers were hot, and the promises that reached them from across the ocean sounded like stories, almost like lies. A country where money could be made if a man had strong hands and no fear of sweat. Giovanni grew up hearing those tales from neighbors who had a cousin in New York or a brother in Chicago. He saw older boys disappear, then reappear in letters stuffed with talk of wages, of jobs in factories and on street crews, of clothes that didn't have to be patched and repatched. In that world, land rarely changed hands. A poor family stayed poor, no matter how hard they worked. For someone with ambition, the only direction that felt open was away. Around 17, he followed that path. The journey to the port alone was an adventure. Walking, riding in crowded carts, sleeping on the floors of cheap lodgings. Then came the ship overfilled, airless, foul. Travelers from his part of Italy carried cheese, bread, old fears, new hopes. Many were sick almost immediately. Days blurred into one another. Gray water, gray sky, the endless creak and groan of the vessel. If he dreamed at night, it was probably of land that didn't move beneath his feet. When he finally saw the American shoreline, it must have seemed unbelievable. Smokestacks, bustling piers, noise and color and dirt all mixed together. From there he traveled inland to the place that would define his life. Chicago, the city he stepped into in the 1,890 seconds, was not the glittering one he would later preside over. It was a place still rebuilding after the fire of 1871, crowded with immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Germany, Poland, and many other places, each group clustering in its own neighborhood. Streets were filthy, stockyards reeked, factories roared. It was a growing city, yes, but also a hard one, and people who didn't speak English and had no skills beyond their backs and hands found themselves at the bottom. There, the young Giovanni became John or Jim, like so many newcomers who adjusted their names to sound a bit less foreign. He did whatever work he could find. At different times, according to later accounts, he swept streets, dug ditches, and worked as a laborer for the city. He joined other Italians on crews that patched roads and cleaned gutters, doing the jobs nobody else wanted. He saw almost immediately that honest work alone didn't lift a man very far. Wages were low, days were long, and there was always another worker ready to take your place. At the same time, he noticed something about the city's politics. On election days, men in fancy coats appeared in the neighborhoods with envelopes and promises. They remembered names. They shook hands. They had power in a way that foremen and small shopkeepers didn't. Chicago's First Ward, where much of the downtown Vice District lay, was controlled by Alderman Michael Hinky Dink Kenna and John Bathhouse John Coughlin. They understood that immigrant votes had value, and they cultivated men who could deliver those votes. Among Italian laborers, Colosimo began to fill that role. He had a booming voice, a ready smile when it suited him, and a willingness to intimidate when that was useful. Over time, he moved from just shoveling and sweeping to acting as a kind of foreman and political fixer, steering his fellow Italians toward the right candidates, making sure certain ballots were cast or not cast. One historian later described him as a ward healer, a lower-level political operative who could be trusted to do the dirty work required to maintain power. Around this period, his contacts with crime deepened. In the crowded Italian districts, extortionists, often called Black Hand, men threatened shopkeepers and laborers with letters demanding money. If you ignored them, windows could be broken, fires set, or worse. Police protection was unreliable. Many victims preferred to pay quietly. In that environment, someone like Colosimo could play a dual role. On one hand, he knew the fear those letters caused. On the other, he understood that violence, or the threat of it, could be turned to his own advantage. Accounts from the time suggest that he started as a kind of mediator and enforcer. He would visit threatened merchants, offer help, and collect payment in return. Whether he was truly shielding them from outside extortionists or simply carving out his own share of their income is hard to say with precision now, but the pattern fit the era. At the same time, he began drifting toward the world of illegal entertainment, gambling, and prostitution. Chicago's Levee District, roughly around 18th to 22nd Streets, was already known as a red light area. Saloons, dance halls, and brothels lined the streets, operating under the watchful and often paid-off eyes of local officials. It was there that he met the woman who would shape his fortunes. Her name was Victoria Moresco. She had built her own business in that district, running houses of prostitution and managing a network of women who worked for her. In a society with limited opportunities for women, especially those who had been pushed to the margins, running such an establishment was one of the few ways to gain financial independence, though it always came with risk and stigma. By the early 1900s, Victoria was well known in the Levee. When she and Colosimo came together, some sources say around 1902, they formed more than a romantic partnership. It was an alliance. She understood the operations of brothels, how to manage staff, how to deal with police raids, how to keep regular customers returning. He brought political contacts, muscle, and the growing respect or fear of the local Italian community. They married, and through that union, his rise accelerated. With her experience and his connections, they expanded beyond a single building. They opened additional houses, each paying regular insurance money to police and ward politicians to minimize interference. Women working there lost large portions of their earnings to the house, to payoffs, to so-called protection. Most had few better options. Poverty, lack of education, and rigid social rules trapped many of them. The profits, though, were enormous for the owners. Newspapers in later years would describe Colosimo as a vice lord of Chicago, a man who controlled dozens of brothels and gambling dens. While exact numbers differ across sources, There is little doubt he oversaw a large network. Reports spoke of him taking a percentage from houses all over the South Side, sometimes appearing in person, sometimes sending collectors. The money he gathered did not sit idle. He reinvested in his own image and in his shield against law enforcement. He wore flashy jewelry, earning nicknames like Diamond Jim. He handed out cash where it would do him the most good. To policemen who could overlook certain activities, to aldermen who could smooth over trouble, to political clubs that needed funding around election time. Those payments were not hidden. In fact, in that era, the relationship between vice and politics in Chicago was almost an open secret. Journalists who tried to expose the system wrote of city officials accepting contributions from saloon keepers and brothel owners in return for licenses and lax enforcement. Reformers railed against this corruption, but their efforts only occasionally resulted in lasting changes. Colosimo thrived in that environment. He spoke English with a heavy accent, but had learned enough to navigate offices and meetings. He moved between Italian neighborhoods, the levee, City Hall, and expensive clothiers with increasing confidence. His body grew heavier, his suits more expensive, his jewelry more ostentatious. Yet behind the public display lay a growing tension. The same kind of extortion threats that once came from outsiders now sometimes targeted him. Anonymous letters warned of bombs and bullets if he didn't pay. In some cases, attacks did occur. Several accounts mention that his property was damaged and that he narrowly escaped harm. He understood that as his wealth increased, so did his profile, and with it the number of people who resented or wanted to feed off his success. In response, he needed more than just the occasional local tough. He needed someone who could organize protection with discipline and efficiency, someone who knew how to deal firmly with extortionists and rivals. Around this time, he turned toward New York, to a younger associate who had been making a name for himself there, a man named Johnny Torrio. That association would later change the entire course of organized crime in Chicago. But before Torrio arrived, Colosimo had already traveled a remarkable distance from a farm village in Calabria to a man whose name was spoken anxiously in police stations and political backrooms. He did not see himself as a petty street criminal anymore. He viewed his operations as business, albeit illegal. Entertainment, as he and others in his line of work liked to call it. He offered drink, music, gambling, and access to sex in a society that publicly disapproved yet privately consumed all of it. The harm fell most heavily on those with the fewest choices. Women controlled by madams, workers kept in line through threats, neighborhoods marked and exploited as vice districts. In a city willing to look the other way as long as money flowed in the right directions, a man like him could feel untouchable. The diamonds, the restaurant, the political friendships, each new acquisition seemed to prove the wisdom of his path. The risks, however, were still there, growing quietly in the shadows he himself had helped create. Years later, when his body lay in a coffin under sky-high flower displays, people would argue about whether he had been a simple brute, a shrewd businessman, a necessary evil, or a symbol of everything wrong with Chicago's power structure. But before any of that, he was still climbing, his eyes set not on the dangers waiting ahead, but on the next house to acquire, the next official to pay, the next layer of security to wrap around a life built on vice. The glittering cafe on Wabash did not exist yet. Prohibition was still in the future. Al Capone was a boy in Brooklyn. For the moment, the man who would be known as Big Jim was just beginning to sense that the world he controlled along those crowded streets might one day belong to him completely if he could keep his enemies in line and his friends satisfied. Word of his growing influence reached beyond Chicago's neighborhoods. In New York, in prisons, in police reports, the name Colosimo started to appear, attached to phrases like levee district, Italian vice operator, and political fixer. He was not yet the dominant organizer of all Italian crime in the city, but he was quickly becoming the most visible. Around 1909, the threats against him intensified. Handwritten letters, often crudely composed in Italian, arrived demanding payment. They were signed with black drawings of daggers or hands, symbols meant to terrify. Many Italian immigrants recognized these as extortion letters tied to what Americans called the Black Hand, a loose label for criminals who used fear rather than any complex organization. House windows linked to him were shattered. There were explosions near properties connected to his operations. No one was killed in those incidents, but they sent a clear message. Someone wanted money, or wanted him gone. Newspapers later described at least one bombing in front of his home. For a man who had built his life on intimidation, finding himself the target of it must have been deeply unsettling. Colosimo knew that local thugs might not be enough to counter these threats. He wanted someone who could confront extortionists decisively. Through underworld channels, he heard of a young man in New York with a reputation for discipline and brains, Johnny Torrio. Torrio, about a decade younger, had grown up partly in Brooklyn, around Navy Street. There, he had worked in and around pool halls, dance clubs, and other small-time rackets. He was known not only for being willing to use force when needed, but for his calm manner and organizational ability. Rather than pick endless personal fights, he preferred structure, clear shares, regular collections, limited unnecessary violence. At some point in 1909, Colosimo sent word asking Torrio to come to Chicago to help handle the extortion problem and to assist in managing his vice income. The offer included opportunity, authority, and a share of profits. For a man like Torrio, Chicago represented a chance to run something larger than a neighborhood gang. When Torrio arrived, he found a city already primed for someone with his approach. Vice in the levee was bustling, but chaotic. Dozens of saloons, brothels, and gambling dens operated under different owners, each paying off various policemen and precinct captains. Politicians skimmed from the top, but did not try to impose a real order. Colosimo had carved out a large territory for himself, especially among Italian-run houses, but his empire needed smoother management. Torrio became his trusted lieutenant. Publicly, Big Jim still played the role of host and political ally, the visible figure in tailored suits and diamonds. Behind the scenes, Torrio organized collectors, standardized payments from brothel keepers, and established simple rules about who could operate where. If an owner wanted to run a house in certain sections, they were expected to deal with Colosimo's people and fall into line. Where threats once came from outsiders, now the threat for owners came from refusal to cooperate. If a saloon or house tried to stay independent, visits would follow. First, there might be friendly conversation about protection and how dangerous the streets could be. If that failed, windows could be broken, or local bullies might be warned to avoid the place. The message was clear: join the system or struggle alone. This kind of arrangement was illegal from every angle. It involved extortion, controlling prostitution, bribing police officers, and interference in law enforcement. Yet in early 20th century Chicago, the line between crime and politics was often blurred. Elected officials needed money to win campaigns and keep their organizations running. Men like Colosimo supplied that money, in exchange for freedom to keep their operations going. As his power grew, so did his desire to be seen as more than a neighborhood vice figure. Around 1910, he began planning a grand restaurant and nightclub that would serve as a respectable front, a place where judges, businessmen, entertainers, and politicians could all gather. It would stand not in the heart of the levee, but closer to Chicago's main streets, with a name that would echo his own, Colosimo's Cafe. When it opened, the cafe reflected his ambitions. It featured fine food, a stage for singers and musicians, and lavish decorations. Diners might have little idea how much of the funding behind their elegant surroundings came from hidden rooms and closed curtains a few blocks away. To them, he appeared as a successful entrepreneur, a man who had pulled himself up and provided jobs. He enjoyed playing host. He walked through the dining room with practiced ease, stopping at tables, greeting well-known faces. Newspapers occasionally ran notes about the celebrities who visited, the music acts booked, the parties held there. The cafe gave him something else he valued, a way to mingle openly with influential people under socially acceptable circumstances. Meanwhile, his core business remained vice. By the mid-1910s, estimates suggested that hundreds of women worked in places under his control or protection. Each house paid a portion of its income upward. The women themselves rarely saw much of what they earned. House madams, security men, politicians, lawyers, and the bosses at the top all claimed slices. Raids did occur from time to time, especially when reformers and church groups pushed city leaders to act against the levee. On those occasions, women would be arrested, saloons temporarily closed, and moral speeches delivered. Yet many of those same houses reopened soon afterward. Fines were paid. Cases quietly dropped. In the background, Colosimo kept sending envelopes to the right desks. His political connections deepened. He became known as a reliable source of campaign funds and a man who could help deliver Italian votes. In working-class wards, men who wanted city jobs often went through intermediaries tied to him. That patronage chain helped reinforce his position. For every person who feared him, there was someone else who believed they owed him. Arrests on serious charges were rare, and when they did happen, they led to little. He might be charged with the vague offense of disorderly conduct or with breaking city ordinances. Either the case would be dismissed, or the penalty so light it became just another cost of doing business. That pattern was common for vice operators whose money reached deeply into local government. For all his success, cracks were forming in the world that had allowed him to thrive. Progressive reform movements were gaining strength, pushing for restrictions on saloons and calling for cleanup of vice districts. Newspapers published exposés of conditions in brothels, describing exploitation and the steady pull of addiction and desperation that trapped many women there. Religious leaders gave sermons against the white slave trade, a phrase of the era used for forced or coerced prostitution. Although some of those accounts included exaggerations aimed at stirring outrage, there was truth at their core. Many women in the levy came from poor backgrounds, had limited education, or had been abandoned by families. Some were migrants from rural America, others immigrants like himself, tricked or pressured into their situations. Once inside the system, leaving could be nearly impossible without outside help. Owners and their enforcers wanted to protect their investments. Public pressure led to a major effort to close the levy district around 1912. The famous Everleigh Club, a high-end house run by two sisters, shut down. Many brothels were raided or forced to move. City officials declared victory over vice. Reformers celebrated. For men like Colosimo, however, this was more a relocation than a defeat. Rather than disappear, the business spread out into other neighborhoods, became less visible, and in some ways more difficult for authorities to track. Colosimo and Torrio adjusted, opening or backing houses under new names, in new parts of town. Instead of a single red light district, vice became more dispersed, tucked behind ordinary businesses or disguised as rooming houses. During this period, his personal life also shifted. His marriage to Victoria, the experienced madam who had helped launch his empire, grew strained. He was getting older and richer, and with that came different tastes and desires. Around the mid-1910 seconds, he became deeply infatuated with a younger woman, a singer named Dale Winter, who performed in local venues. She represented glamour of a different sort. Not the rough edges of the levee, but the smoother world of stages and bright lights. His affection for Dale created not just a personal rift, but a business complication. Victoria had long-standing control over many houses and knew where money flowed. If their split became official, it threatened to upset arrangements built over years. Still, he pursued the new relationship, spending money on her career and inviting her into his social circle. Here again, the pattern of his life appeared. Loyalty mattered to him when it served his interests. But he did not let old ties block what he wanted. Just as he had once turned from hard labor to illegal business, he now turned from his first wife to the new love who fit his rising image as the polished host of a famous cafe. Eventually, he separated from Victoria, and though the formal legal process took time, the break was real. While all this unfolded, the political climate in the United States was shifting toward a new, enormous change. Nationwide prohibition of alcoholic drinks. Temperance movements had been building for decades, arguing that alcohol destroyed families and fueled crime. By the late 1910 seconds, they had gathered enough momentum for a constitutional amendment. For many in the underworld, the coming ban on alcohol looked like a vast new opportunity. Beer and liquor would still be demanded by millions, but soon could no longer be sold openly. Police would be stretched, trying to enforce the new law. Someone willing to take the risk of smuggling and distributing illegal drink could make far more than prostitution and gambling had ever brought in. Johnny Torrio saw this future clearly. To him, the potential profits of bootleg alcohol dwarfed the existing vice market. He began thinking beyond the levee, beyond a single cafe, imagining a network of stills, breweries, delivery trucks, and protection for speakeasies. It would require capital, organization, and readiness to challenge rivals who would inevitably rush into the same trade. Colosimo, by contrast, felt differently. He was in his early 40s by the time Prohibition neared. He had money, status, and a comfortable role. His main enterprises, brothels, and gambling operations had run for years under a stable system of payoffs. To him, alcohol smuggling seemed like an unnecessary gamble that could attract too much attention and bring a level of conflict he no longer wanted. Accounts from people who knew them suggest that arguments arose between the two men over this issue. Torrio urged expansion into liquor. Colosimo hesitated, then finally refused. He preferred the known world he had already mastered. He did not want to invite new battles with police forces and rival groups over truck routes and hidden warehouses. That disagreement did more than just reveal a difference in temperament. It hinted at a deeper division. One man looking to secure what he had, the other looking toward a much larger, more dangerous future. In any criminal arrangement, such a split can be fatal. Meanwhile, Torrio had quietly begun building his own base. As early as 1919, he had arranged for a tough young man from Brooklyn to join him in Chicago, a former bouncer and sometime enforcer who had worked with the 5 Points gang. His name was Alphonse Al Capone. Capone started as a doorman and bouncer at one of the suburbs' roadhouses, watching doors, handling troublemakers, and learning the layout of Chicago's vice world. He was not yet the infamous figure he would later become. At that stage, he was simply muscle with a reputation for toughness and loyalty to Torrio. Their arrival and growing presence would, in a few short years, transform Chicago's criminal landscape. But as the final months of legal alcohol ticked away, Big Jim still walked confidently through his cafe, still collected from his network, still believed that he could choose which illegal ventures to embrace and which to avoid. He had spent decades proving that in Chicago, with enough money, connections, and nerve, a man could carve out a protected space for himself, sheltered from most consequences. What he could not yet see was that the system he had helped build was evolving beyond him, that younger, more ruthless figures were waiting, and that his refusal to adapt would place him directly in their path. By the late 1910 seconds, the man who had once dug ditches for the city now moved through Chicago like a local monarch. He had a house with fine furniture, a restaurant where chandeliers glowed every night, and an army of employees and hangers-on who watched his moods carefully. When he appeared at the door of Colosimo's cafe in the evening, drivers in front straightened up, doormen hurried to open the way, and waiters along the wall suddenly looked busier. Inside, the place hummed. Tables filled with businessmen, politicians, visiting actors, and people who just wanted to taste a little of the glamour they read about in newspapers. The band on stage drifted from light opera pieces to popular songs. On some nights, when the room was packed, Big Jim would stand near the bar, smoking slowly, pleased that everyone could see what he had built. He liked being recognized. He also liked to remind people that he was no longer just another tough in the levee. He wore tailored coats, silk vests, and enough jewelry to catch the eye from across a room. He spoke with an accent, but he had learned the rhythms of English well enough to banter with judges and aldermen. In public, he was careful. No talk about brothels. No mention of how many envelopes left his office for police stations each week. In that room, he was a legitimate businessman entertaining guests. Behind the public show, the old machinery of vice kept turning. Women still worked long hours in houses that paid a share of their earnings up the chain. Gamblers still lost paychecks in rooms protected by his men. Street-level enforcers still walked beat-up sidewalks, making sure doors stayed open where they were supposed to, and closed promptly when the police needed a show of effort. That hidden system remained his main source of income. His relationship with Victoria, the wife who had helped him climb into that world, had nearly reached its end. Years of arguments, jealousy, and business disputes eroded whatever partnership they once had. By now, Victoria was more an opponent than an ally. She controlled property and knew a great deal about the past. He, in turn, controlled the pipeline of money and the politicians who made problems disappear. When his attachment to the singer Dale Winter grew stronger, the marriage finally cracked. Dale was younger, American-born, ambitious. She worked on stages, not in back rooms. To Big Jim, she represented everything he now wanted to be associated with: music, respectability, high society. He poured money into her career, supported her shows, and presented her proudly at the cafe. Formal separation from Victoria brought lawsuits and headlines. She accused him of mistreatment and of taking property that should be hers. He fought back through lawyers. In the end, he did pay, but not nearly as much as she believed she deserved. The legal disputes reminded Chicago that his fortune was tied to houses described in polite language as disorderly resorts. Reformers pointed to his case as proof that vice bosses could enrich themselves while the people under them remained trapped. Despite the negative publicity, his standing in the underworld stayed strong. He still had Torrio organizing collections. He still had enough friendly officers to warn him of coming raids. When one of his houses was shut down, another could quietly open a few streets away. It was an old pattern. Public outrage, brief crackdowns, then a return to the previous arrangements once attention shifted. The war years came and went. Many young men left for Europe. Factories boomed. Chicago grew even more crowded. Immigrant neighborhoods stayed poor, their residents still easy targets for extortion and exploitation. Some shopkeepers paid protection money both to so-called Black Hand extortionists and to Colosimo's people, hoping that at least one of those groups would keep the others away. Whether such protection really kept them safe is doubtful, but fear and habit often carried more weight than rational calculation. Through it all, Torrio proved himself invaluable. He kept accounts, talked to brewing interests, calmed disputes among gamblers, and smoothed over bruised egos. Where Big Jim liked to show himself in public, Torrio preferred quiet rooms and simple clothes. The balance between them, one visible, one in the background, suited both for a time. Then, in 1919, a new reality moved from talk to certainty. The 18th Amendment had been ratified. The Volstead Act, spelling out the details of enforcing the alcohol ban, passed. A firm date stood on the calendar. Early 1920, when legal drinking in the United States would end. People in every corner of Chicago talked about it. Some saloon owners felt panic. Some church leaders rejoiced. And in the city's back rooms, men like Torrio calculated. He saw the map differently than his older partner. From his perspective, beer and liquor already flowed through the same kinds of places they controlled: saloons, dance halls, roadhouses outside city limits. Once the ban went into effect, demand would not vanish. It would move underground, just as prostitution and much gambling already had. Whoever organized that flow, from breweries and distilleries to hidden bars, could become richer and more powerful than any levee boss had ever been. To do that, however, he needed not only capital, but clear authority. Ownership of vehicles, control of warehouses, agreements with tavern owners and corrupt officials. All of it required someone at the top who backed the plan completely. Instead, he encountered resistance from the man whose name stood over the door of the Grand Café. Big Jim was unimpressed by the dream of bootlegging empires. He had spent years taking money from saloons and tolerated beer as one more draw for customers. But he had never organized production or large-scale distribution. That kind of business threatened to bring federal agents into a picture that had previously involved mostly city police and local courts. Federal enforcement, he believed, would not be as easy to influence with envelopes and favors. There was another reason for his reluctance. He felt he had already arrived. He had property, a new young wife, a famous restaurant. His main worries had shifted from surviving street attacks to choosing the right entertainer for the weekend crowds. To him, life finally felt secure. Taking on a massive, risky new enterprise that could lead to open warfare seemed foolish. Men who later spoke of those days recalled tense conversations behind closed doors. Torrio and his close associates argued that other groups Irish on the north side, various gangs in the outlying districts, were already preparing to jump into the liquor trade. If they did not move quickly, they would lose ground and income. Big Jim shrugged. The vice rackets he controlled still paid well. Why chase something that might topple everything? In 1918, he had married Dale Winter. They lived for a time in California, where she worked in theater. For months, he left much of Chicago's day Underworld administration in Torrio's hands. That period allowed Torrio to deepen his own relationships, to see how much of the machine could operate smoothly without Big Jim's constant presence. When the couple returned, Colosimo wanted to step back into his old role, but the balance had begun to shift. Capone, by now working at a suburban resort called the Four Deuces, and later other roadhouses tied to Torrio, watched and learned. He handled rowdy drunkards, escorted important guests, and enforced house rules. He saw how money moved from illegal rooms to respectable banks, how judges and officials accepted quiet payments, how police wagons knew which doors to visit for show and which to ignore. For a young man used to rough Brooklyn streets, Chicago's organized vice looked like the future. Rumors circulated that Torrio and his younger men were already opening channels to brewers on the South Side, making promises for after the ban took effect. None of those arrangements could flourish fully, however, if the recognized head of their Italian group refused to sanction wholesale liquor dealing. Rival gangs needed only a small crack in the Italians' front to start picking off saloons and districts. On the 17th of January 1920, Prohibition began. Saloons shuttered or pretended to transform into soft drink parlors. Barrels were rolled out under watchful eyes. Some owners poured expensive stock into sewers for the newspapers, then quietly hid the rest. Churches held meetings of thanks. Supporters of the new law spoke of a future with less crime and misery. Reality on Chicago's streets changed, but not in the way those supporters hoped. Almost immediately, secret bars, speakeasies appeared behind false doors and in basements. Private clubs offered near beer, with something stronger slipped into glasses from hidden containers. Doctors wrote prescriptions for medicinal whiskey. Delivery trucks made routes at odd hours, watched carefully by both the police and those who hoped to rob or tax them. Torrio observed this and saw confirmation of his belief. He pushed again. Their organization, he argued, needed to claim territory in this new world quickly. He could handle the planning. All he needed was Big Jim's approval, some startup money from their existing profits, and a clear promise that anyone connected to their group would follow the plan. Big Jim still resisted. He allowed liquor to appear in controlled ways at the cafe, under the cover of private parties and backroom service. That alone required some quiet arrangements, since his place was too prominent to take obvious chances. Yet he drew a line at vast operations that would fill warehouses or move convoys of trucks. He spoke of wanting to retire from active management someday, perhaps to enjoy life with Dale away from danger. That attitude, reasonable in the mind of a man who had spent long years in crime, sounded like stubborn weakness to those whose ambitions were just hitting their stride. For Torrio and the impatient younger men under him, Big Jim began to look less like a benevolent boss and more like a heavy anchor. Around this time, old fears returned as well. Despite his size and reputation, Colosimo knew he had enemies. Some were personal. Some were other vice operators who resented his past attempts to dominate them. Some, perhaps, were men tied to the earlier Black Hand periods, who had not forgotten past conflicts. He rarely moved anywhere without bodyguards. Private detectives watched his house. He carried protection when out of sight of the law and behaved carefully when in it. Even with all that caution, he relaxed at the cafe. That building, bearing his name, felt like an extension of himself. Employees there knew better than to cross him. He believed that anyone seeking to harm him there would have to fight through layers of doors and people who owed him their livelihoods. In the spring of 1920, pressures on him piled up. Legal disputes with Victoria still simmered. Reform groups pressed city leaders once again to act against brothels. The press kept connecting his name to vice trusts. Inside his own organization, whispers grew that he had gone soft, that he no longer wanted to do what had to be done. Some accounts from later years based on police speculation, gang testimony, and underworld gossip suggest that Torrio began to consider a future without Big Jim. They hint at conversations with allies back in New York, including a tough Brooklyn boss named Francesco Frankie Uale, known in America as Frankie Yale. Yale specialized in providing muscle, including killers for hire, to other gang leaders. Whether such plans were discussed exactly as later writers described them cannot be proven conclusively. Records from that world were rarely written down, yet many historians agree on the main point. As long as Big Jim stood in the way of a full move into bootlegging, he stood in the way of Torrio's designs. In that kind of underworld, obstacles sometimes vanished suddenly. On the 11th of May 1920, Chicago was damp and overcast when Colosimo left home. The date itself held no meaning to him beyond the day's appointments. He had tasks at the cafe, meetings to attend, people to see. Business, as far as he knew, continued as usual. The restaurant staff prepared for the evening crowd, polishing glasses and setting tables. Deliveries came and went through the back entrance. Somewhere across town, men who had been talking quietly for weeks moved into position, following a plan that would be discussed for decades afterward, but never proven in court. Big Jim, comfortable in his role, moved toward the one place in the city where he had always felt entirely in command, unaware that the order he believed he maintained had already slipped from his grasp. He reached the cafe in the late morning, when the big front room was quiet and half-lit, chairs still upside down on tables. That was often his favorite time there. No band, no laughter, no demands for attention. Just the clink of plates in the kitchen, the scrape of a broom on the floor, the smell of coffee and damp wood rising from the empty space. He came in through the front, as usual, nodding to the men on duty. A trusted driver had brought him over. Sometimes he rode alone, other times with bodyguards. That morning he did not have a heavy escort. He felt safe enough in his own place. The staff who saw him remembered nothing unusual. He wore one of his better suits and the usual jewelry. He walked slowly down the central aisle, glanced at the stage, checked a few details with the manager. Deliveries were expected. A wedding party had booked the back room for later in the week. There were always small matters needing his approval. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the sidewalks outside slick and the air cool. Inside, the building felt close and warm, the way older city structures often do. The front doors faced the street, but behind the main dining area, a warren of smaller rooms extended toward the alley, kitchen, storage areas, an office, spots where staff changed and counted money. Near the rear entrance was a little cloakroom where coats and packages could be left. Sometime close to noon, he was told that a delivery man wanted to see him in that back area. Accounts differ on what exactly he was told. Packages, supplies, maybe something that required a signature. In any case, no one reported him showing concern. This was the kind of detail handled every day in a busy establishment. He walked toward the rear alone, or nearly alone, past swinging doors, through the narrower hallway at the back. Kitchen workers heard his footsteps recede. A few seconds later, someone also in that area would recall hearing a sharp sound. Some said one. Some thought two that echoed strangely in the confined space. When people rushed toward the hallway, drawn by the noise, they found their employer lying on the floor of the cloakroom near the back entrance. A bullet had ended his life quickly. The man who had controlled so much of Chicago's underworld lay motionless in a cramped, quiet space, his diamonds catching the soft light from a nearby window. The shooter was gone. News traveled fast. Within minutes, panic and confusion spread through the cafe. Employees argued about whether to move the body. Someone telephoned the police. Outside, passers-by noticed activity at the doors. Within an hour, squads of officers and plainclothes detectives had arrived, pushing curious onlookers back from the entrance. It did not take long for the press to appear. Reporters knew that anything involving Big Jim would be front-to-page material. They jotted down names, peered through doorways, and tried to coax comments from shaken waiters and cooks. The boldest slipped in behind officers to catch a glimpse of the scene. Police found little usable evidence. No one had seen the actual shooting clearly. Some thought they might have noticed a stranger hanging around near the back earlier, but descriptions were vague. A man in a coat, maybe wearing a cap, of medium build. In an era before security cameras, any such detail was almost useless. Almost immediately, officers and journalists began asking the question that would never be answered with certainty: who had ordered the killing? On the surface, investigators talked about the most obvious kind of suspects. Enemies from the old extortion days, men who had tried to bomb his property years before, or resentful rivals from the levee. Perhaps, they suggested, this was a simple case of revenge. Maybe someone he had once threatened, fined, or pushed out of business had decided to strike back. But the timing and circumstances did not look like a spontaneous act. The shooter had known where to wait, which entrance to use, and when to expect him in a relatively unguarded moment. That suggested planning and inside information. Whispers began almost at once that this had been an inside job from his own circle, connected to the dispute over entering the liquor trade. Detectives heard those rumors, wrote them in notebooks, and passed them up the chain. Officially, the police stuck to broader theories in public. Unofficially, many of them suspected what later historians would conclude: that the path to the future of organized crime in Chicago had just been cleared. When the news reached Johnny Torrio, he appeared at the cafe looking solemn, expressing shock and sorrow. He spoke to officers, told them he had no idea who could have done such a thing, and promised his full cooperation. He repeated that sentiment to reporters. He had worked loyally for Big Jim, he said, and would help bring the killer to justice. Whatever he felt privately, he showed no impatience. He let events unfold at their own speed. He knew that in Chicago, high-profile murders, especially those with political entanglements, were often investigated intensely for a short time, then gradually set aside as newer stories arose. Across town, former associates and competitors reacted with a mix of surprise, satisfaction, and nervousness. Some had feared him, some respected him, some had lost money or freedom because of his decisions. None could ignore the fact that his death left a gap in the delicate balance of power. One of the first public hints that this killing might be tied to internal gang politics came from the pattern of questions police chose not to press too hard. They asked Torrio about known enemies, asked about extortion letters, asked about old disputes. They did not push deeply into his recent disagreements with Big Jim over bootlegging. That line, if pursued vigorously, might have led to uncomfortable corners of city government and beyond. As the investigation opened, attention also turned to his private life. His separated first wife, Victoria, was still alive and still vocal. She had sued him, accused him of withholding assets. Now, with his sudden death, she spoke to the press again, bitterly criticizing not only him but the entire vice system that had allowed him to prosper. She insisted that whatever riches he left behind owed much to her early partnership. His second wife, Dale Winter, faced an entirely different kind of glare. She was younger, a public performer, suddenly a widow whose husband's name appeared in headlines alongside words like gang and vice. For her, the glamour of being married to a famous cafe owner had turned overnight into something darker. Grief and practical worries collided. There were questions about the estate, about what exactly he owned, about debts and claims. As those personal dramas played out, the city saw a vivid display of how much he had meant not just to criminals and politicians, but to ordinary residents who had watched his rise. His funeral became a spectacle. Dozens of cars joined the procession. Streetcars paused as it passed. Thousands turned out along the route, some out of respect, others simply curious. Flower arrangements were so numerous and elaborate that they drew their own coverage, towering displays shaped into arches and crosses. His diamonds, which had always been part of his public image, were displayed under glass in the funeral parlor, where lines of visitors filed past to gaze at them, and at the face of the man whose story had become a kind of local legend. Some clucked their tongues and called it vulgar, a show of wealth gained from misery. Others saw it as the natural end of a self-made man who had wanted admiration above all. In that moment, judgment depended heavily on where one stood in Chicago's social ladder. For waiters who had relied on tips from his cafe, for district captains who had counted on his contributions, for women whose livelihoods had been bound to his houses, his absence meant turmoil more than moral reflection. Newspapers covered the ceremony in measured language, describing him as a slain vice king and Southside cafe owner. They wrote about his humble origins, his rise, his violence-shadowed career. Editors used the event to comment on the alliance between crime and politics, hinting at corruption but stopping short of naming higher officials. While priests spoke of mercy over his coffin, his old machine continued to run, at least for the moment. Collections did not simply halt, because the top man was gone. Houses still owed money. Police still expected envelopes. Gamblers still needed protection. Someone had to step in quickly before rivals tried to chip away at the territory. That someone was, inevitably, Johnny Torrio. Within days, he began presenting himself quietly as the natural successor. He had long handled many day-to-day operations. He had the trust of key lieutenants. He also had a reputation for keeping his head when others lost theirs, for preferring negotiation to open warfare when possible. In meetings held far from curious eyes, he reassured allies that the old arrangements would continue, with some adjustments. Payments would still arrive, properties would still pay their expected shares. At the same time, he signaled to younger men like Al Capone that a new era was beginning, one in which liquor would stand alongside prostitution and gambling as a pillar of revenue. The murder investigation dragged on, formally. Detectives questioned known troublemakers, brought in suspected black hand figures, checked alibis for various rival gang members. They kept files, wrote reports, and called the press together occasionally to declare that they were pursuing all leads. Yet no one was ever charged. Over time, the case slipped into that familiar Chicago category. An unsolved killing of a prominent underworld figure, mentioned in anniversary pieces and history columns, but never resolved. Different theories hardened as years passed. One held that a resentful former bodyguard or employee, perhaps tied to Victoria, had arranged the shooting to settle old scores. Another suggested the work of black-hand extortionists who had never stopped targeting him. But these ideas never matched the precise timing and location of the crime. The view accepted by most historians today points strongly toward Torrio's involvement, motivated by the conflict over prohibition. According to that interpretation, Torrio either directly ordered the hit or at least approved it, likely with the help of gunmen brought in from outside Chicago to avoid immediate suspicion. The name most often mentioned in this connection is Frankie Yale, the Brooklyn boss who had occasionally done such work for other gang leaders. Some accounts, written long after the events, even place a young Al Capone on the scene as a helper or lookout. Evidence for that detail remains thin, and it may simply be part of the mythology that grew up around Capone's larger-than-life image. Still, those stories persisted because they fit a broader narrative, the passing of power from an older generation of Italian racketeers to a newer, more aggressive one. Whatever the exact chain of orders, the outcome was clear. With Big Jim gone, there was no one standing in the way of a full dive into bootlegging. Torrio wasted little time. He used the existing web of saloons, brothels, and gambling parlors to distribute illegal drink. Some houses that had once only offered companionship and cards now also served whiskey and beer behind locked doors. He cut deals with brewery owners, some of whom had quickly retooled their operations to continue making alcohol in defiance of the Volstead Act. In some cases, former legal breweries simply hid their production or changed labels to disguise shipments. The very politicians who had once taken money from prostitution earnings now accepted larger sums tied to liquor. Truck routes were mapped. Drivers were hired and warned about hijackers. Private guards rode along. In neighborhoods where Irish gangs had strong roots, talks were open to avoid immediate violent conflict. Territories were sketched out, sometimes adjusted later through force. Big Jim's old specialty prostitution and gambling is sometimes overshadowed in memory by the dramatic bootlegging battles of the 1920 seconds. Yet without his earlier consolidation of vice, the infrastructure Torrio needed would not have existed so neatly. The system of payoffs, the habit of regular collections, the practice of corrupting public officials, all had been refined in the Levy era. In that sense, Big Jim's legacy went far beyond his lifetime. Even though he never wanted to embrace the liquor business fully, the network he built formed the base on which the bootlegging economy rose. The same streets that had once carried his collectors now saw trucks rumble by at odd hours. The same officers who had once ignored illegal rooms now stepped aside for caravans of contraband. For ordinary residents, the change felt subtle at first. Brothels were no longer as concentrated in a single red light zone, but had spread. Some saloons closed, others seemed to transform into quiet cafes or soft-to-drink parlors, yet still served familiar customers with a wink. Violence, when it came, was often sudden and at night, involving men whose names few outside the underworld knew yet. Those who had known Big Jim personally, waiters, drivers, women who worked in his houses, adjusted as best they could. Some continued under Torrio's leadership, seeing little difference at street level beyond new faces at the top. Others drifted away, replaced by fresh arrivals from poorer neighborhoods or from overseas, repeating the same cycle of exploitation under new management. As years went on and Chicago's gang conflicts became national news, the memory of that morning in May 1920 lingered in the minds of older policemen and reporters. They would recall how a single bullet in a back hallway had marked the end of the city's first great Italian vice boss and opened the way for a far more notorious period. In quieter moments, away from headlines and legends, a simpler truth emerged. Giovanni Big Jim Colosimo had been a child of poverty in southern Italy, a laborer in an unfamiliar city, a fixer, an extortionist, a brothel owner, a gambler, a briber of officials, and finally a victim of the same world he had done so much to shape. His death inside the business he had created showed how fragile power built on fear and corruption could be. Yet, even as his name began fading from popular memory, replaced by louder figures like Capone, the structures and methods he had pioneered in Chicago's underworld kept working, adapted to new markets and harsher rivalries. The cafe that had once been his pride became just another property in a larger portfolio of illicit wealth, and the city moved on into a decade that would make his reign seem almost modest by comparison. When the crowds drifted away from his grave and the flower arches began to wilt, the city returned to its usual pace. Streetcars rattled, stockyards smoked, and in the downtown offices where records piled high, clerks and investigators still had his name on their desks. In the weeks after his death, lawyers, police, and journalists dug back through years of files that mentioned Big Jim Colosimo. Those papers told a story that stretched far beyond one shot in a dark hallway. They traced how a man who started with almost nothing had built his fortune on fear and exploitation, how often he had been accused, and how rarely those accusations had brought real punishment. Some of the earliest surviving references to him in official records come from the years when he was still only partly known outside the Italian quarter. He had arrived in Chicago in the 1,890 seconds and worked on street crews. Along the way, he picked up a few minor arrests, brawling, disturbances, small-time offenses that were common among hard-pressed immigrants. None of those early cases marked him out as a future crime boss. They simply showed a young man who refused to be meek in a rough environment. What turned him from a noisy laborer into a figure of real influence was his move into extortion and commercialized vice. By the first decade of the new century, reformers, district captains, and policemen all recognized that an Italian named Colosimo was becoming a central broker in the South Side's unofficial economy. Merchants in Italian neighborhoods told stories about receiving threatening notes, sometimes decorated with crude drawings of daggers or darkened hands. The letters demanded money in exchange for safety. Those who paid often found that the threats stopped. Those who hesitated sometimes saw rocks through windows or small fires outside their doors. The press labeled this pattern Black Hand activity, although in reality it was usually small groups of criminals, not a single organized society. Into that atmosphere walked Colosimo, offering what he called protection. He had the right friends, he said. He could speak to the men causing trouble. He could make the letters stop for a price. Some victims believed he truly was intervening with independent extortionists. Others suspected, quietly, that the very men sending the letters were somehow tied to the people demanding payment for protection. Few dared say that loudly. From this business, he moved steadily toward running and controlling houses of prostitution. By marrying Victoria Moresco, a capable madam with several houses already running in the levee, he joined his political pull with her operational skills. Together, according to later investigations, they either owned outright or took a regular share from dozens of resorts scattered through the district. Records from the Chicago Vice Commission, a body formed in 1910 to study and combat organized vice, repeatedly mention his name. Investigators traced financial arrangements showing that houses in certain blocks all paid to the same pockets. Witnesses described how envelopes were collected at regular intervals and carried upward through layers of managers. People doing that collection worked for him. The Commission's lengthy report in 1911 did not list every address tied to him, but it made clear that he was among a small group of men who reaped enormous profits from what the report called commercialized immorality. It described systems in which women were recruited, sometimes deceived, sometimes pressured into working in houses where they lost control over their earnings and their movement. Money they received from clients passed to the madam, who paid rent, bribes, and a fixed percentage to men higher up the chain. Those men included Colosimo. There were also federal investigations. In 1909, a grand jury looked into alleged trafficking of women across state lines for illegal purposes. In that period, sensational stories about white slavery, forced prostitution filled headlines. Some reports leaned toward panic and exaggeration, but they did expose genuine abuses. Names from the Chicago vice world, including his, appeared in some of those inquiries. He was indicted more than once on charges related to running disorderly houses or participating in such trafficking. Yet in case after case, either the prosecution faltered or the charges were reduced. Witnesses vanished, changed stories, or seemed suddenly unsure under questioning. The pattern matched a broader reality. Men with money to hire lawyers and connections to influence officials rarely faced full accountability. Still, traces of what went on inside those houses slipped into public view. The Vice Commission interviewed women who had tried to leave and described being threatened or locked in rooms until they changed their minds. Others spoke of being in debt for clothing and lodging, debts controlled entirely by house operators. While these interviews did not always name him personally, they pointed to practices common in the very district where he ruled. He also drifted into another corner of illegal enterprise: gambling, saloons. He influenced hosted backroom card games and betting on numbers or sporting events. Men who ran those games paid a portion of their profits for the right to operate without constant harassment. If an outsider tried to open a game without his blessing, they might find their location suddenly raided more often or visited by unfriendly faces who made it clear that business would be easier if they joined the existing arrangement. In politics, his record was no cleaner. Early on, he had served as a foot soldier for ward bosses, herding voters from boarding houses to polling stations, making sure ballots were cast as instructed. As his influence grew, he graduated from follower to local power in his own right. Italian residents who wanted city jobs or favors often felt they had to go through him or someone tied to him. Favored men from his circle got street cleaning contracts and other municipal work. Stories circulated of election days when known opponents of his favorites were discouraged from voting, sometimes by blunt warnings, sometimes by fists. Complaints occasionally reached higher authorities, but proving specific acts in the hurly-burly of a Chicago election was difficult, especially when officers on the scene owed part of their livelihoods to the very machine being accused. The law did catch up with him in small ways. He was arrested on morals charges more than once, often alongside Victoria, for operating or maintaining disorderly houses. In 1911, he was among those named in civic reports as a main figure in the city's vice syndicate. But when those cases reached court, fines were light, and closing one house merely pushed business to another address. Privately, he showed little sign of remorse. In his mind, he was providing a service people clearly wanted. The men who came into his district seeking gambling, companionship, and drink kept the system running. As long as voters returned the same aldermen, as long as police commissioners maintained the same arrangements, he saw little reason to think of himself as uniquely guilty. Yet the personal consequences of his choices appeared vividly in the lives of those around him. His marriage to Victoria fractured under the strain of money, jealousy, and control. When she finally took him to court seeking divorce and a fair share of their property, she painted a stark picture. A husband who had made a fortune from houses she helped establish, then pushed her aside when she no longer fit his image. Court documents from their divorce proceedings show sharp accusations from both sides. She claimed he had treated her cruelly and cheated her financially. He countered by portraying himself as the sole architect of their wealth. Behind the legal language lay a familiar story. A powerful man refusing to share credit or assets with a woman who had been essential in the early years. The case drew press attention not only because of their personalities, but because it hinted at the scale of his holdings. Even conservative estimates placed his income in the hundreds of thousands of dollars over time, an enormous sum in that era. That income had come overwhelmingly from illegal businesses, houses of prostitution, gambling resorts, and protection arrangements. To many readers, the idea that such a person could fight about property in open court, rather than face long imprisonment, symbolized how little real control the city had over its own vice industry. When he married the singer Dale Winter in 1918, he further distanced himself from the world he had once shared with Victoria and the Levy's rougher side. He spent time in California, supporting Dale's stage work and presenting himself as a successful businessman rather than a vice boss. But even during that period away, his Chicago machine did not stop. Torrio ensured that payments continued, and that the loose federation of brothel operators, gamblers, and saloon keepers still knew where their obligations lay. Looking back from the vantage point after his death, investigators could see a clear pattern. A man who had climbed from low-paid street labor into multiple layers of crime, then wrapped those activities in a cloak of semi-respectability through his cafe and political friendships. He had profited from fear in his own immigrant community, from the vulnerability of women with few options, from the weakness of public institutions meant to uphold the law. Even his method of handling internal discipline reflected that approach. When disputes arose within his network, two owners quarreling over territory, a collector suspected of holding back money he preferred to settle matters behind closed doors. Sometimes that meant ordering a cut in someone's share, sometimes removing a man from a route, sometimes issuing threats that left no doubt about consequences. Violence remained a last resort. He did not want chaos that might attract attention. But the possibility of harm was always there, hanging over anyone tempted to cross him. In neighborhoods where he held sway, that reputation replaced formal authority. Residents learned that going to the police with complaints about one of his favored houses was usually pointless. Officers might listen politely, but nothing changed. In some cases, complainants later found themselves visited by strangers who suggested, in calm tones, that it might be safer to remain quiet. After his killing, some of those same residents watched with interest to see whether anything would change. For a short while, uncertainty on the street did grow. Rumors flew that rival groups might strike at his former territory now that he was gone. Working men wondered whether the insurance they paid would go up or down. Women in his old houses whispered among themselves about whether the new bosses would be harsher or more lenient. Legally, his passing opened the question of who would inherit his property. That question quickly turned into a tangle of lawsuits. Victoria, the estranged first wife, claimed rights to a significant portion of his estate, arguing that without her early investments and experience, he never would have reached his later position. Dale, the widow, had marriage documents and the support of his more recent business allies. Courts weighed marriage dates, property transfers, and prior settlements. All of this unfolded in public filings that again pulled his name into headlines. While bootlegging wars slowly ignited on the streets, in the quieter world of probate hearings, his life was measured out in deeds, bank accounts, and contested claims. Over time, Dale received enough support to maintain herself and eventually returned to the stage, determined to build a life that did not rely on his legacy. Victoria fought hard for her share and did succeed in recovering some value, though never as much as she believed was just. Neither woman could fully escape being tied, in the public mind, to a man known more for vice than for any legitimate achievement. Police, too, used the pause after his death to review how they had handled him. Some reform-minded officials argued that if earlier accusations against him and other vice bosses had been pursued more vigorously, the systems that later fed bootlegging empires might have been crippled. Others, more cynical, shrugged and said that someone else would simply have taken his place. In a city where demand for illegal pleasures remained constant, supply would always find a path. That debate continued in various forms for years. Civic committees issued new reports, referencing him as one in a line of figures who had exploited weak enforcement and political protection. Journalists writing about the spectacular violence of the later 1,920 seconds often paused to mention him as an early architect of the city's criminal structure, the man who had shown that an Italian from a poor background could rise to control an enormous underground business. In those retellings, his specific crimes sometimes blurred into a general image: brothel keeper, gambling lord, extortionist, corrupter of officials. The granularity of particular cases: the shopkeeper coerced into paying for protection, the young woman pressured into staying at a resort, the independent saloon owner forced to accept his terms slipped into the background. Yet those individual stories were where the impact of his choices had been felt most deeply. As the years after his death unfolded, and the names Torrio and Capone climbed into national consciousness, fewer people remembered the heavy-set man with the diamonds who had once been called the King of the Levy. But in the files stacked in back rooms and basements, the outline of his career remained: a paper trail of raids, arrests, dropped charges, civil suits, and civic reports that, pieced together, showed clearly how thoroughly he had entwined crime with everyday life in early 20th century Chicago. Long after his cafe changed hands and his name faded from awnings, anyone who took the time to read those old reports could see the direct line from his early extortion and prostitution rackets to the more elaborate underworld systems that followed. His life had ended in a quiet back hallway, but the methods he had used and the damage he had done continued to shape the city far beyond that single noon in May. In the months after his death, Chicago rushed forward into its new age of liquor battles, but the quieter record of what Big Jim had actually done was still being pieced together in offices and back rooms. To understand the size of the shadow he cast, you have to step back into the years when he was already powerful but not yet a national name, when he walked the streets of the First Ward as if they were his private corridor. The First Ward was the political heart of downtown Chicago, run by Michael Hinky Dink Kenna and John Bathhouse John Coughlin. They were showmen in their own way, parading in gaudy suits and holding noisy banquets. But beneath the jokes and songs lay a disciplined machine. Every saloon, every brothel, every gambling den in their territory paid something for the privilege of staying open. They could shut you down or make you flourish with a word. Colosimo attached himself early to that system. As a younger man, before the diamonds in the famous cafe, he was one of the many intermediaries who carried cash from vice operators to ward offices and carried political favors back in return. He learned quickly that the fastest way off the street crew was to become indispensable to men like Kenna and Coughlin. Witnesses later told investigators that on election days he moved through the Italian precincts directing groups of voters almost like drill squads. He would appear in a doorway, call out names, and lead men to the polling place, making sure they understood whose names to mark. Illiterate laborers trusted him to explain the ballot. Those who hesitated might be reminded, gently or not, that the jobs they hoped for and the peace they enjoyed depended on cooperation. That dance between crime and politics suited him perfectly. He discovered that you could be both feared and welcomed at the same time. Shopkeepers sought his help when they needed a license. At the same time, they dreaded the knock that meant it was time to pay for protection. Politicians liked his reliability around elections. They understood, even if they rarely said it aloud, where his money came from. The Levy district, where he built his first real fortune, had a strange, almost theatrical atmosphere. On certain nights, its main streets were crowded with men in suits, women in bright dresses, newsboys calling out headlines, and barkers advertising music and dancing. Behind those front rooms lay rows of chambers where lives were quietly ground down. The Everleigh Club, the most famous house in the area, grabbed the headlines with its velvet and chandeliers, but it was only one piece of a much bigger arrangement. All around it stood more modest resorts, some run by Victoria, some by other madams who paid into the same system. Those houses did not bother with luxury. They were there to turn clients as quickly as possible. Colosimo's role in this landscape was not to stand at the door of every house. His power came from organizing and taxing the entire district. Investigators later concluded that he and a handful of others had worked out an informal agreement. Each controlled certain blocks. Each accepted a standard flow of payments from the businesses there. Each shared out bribes to officials who kept real interference at bay. One internal city report described him as a collector and beneficiary, a phrase that captured his distance from the day-to-day misery that fueled his accounts. Women inside the houses saw the madam, the doorman, the regular policeman on the beat. Big Jim seldom appeared in person. Yet on payday, a portion of their earnings moved upward in envelopes or through bank deposits, eventually landing in pockets like his. Occasionally, those envelopes became the subject of formal inquiries. Reform groups pushed for commissions to examine vice. Clergymen, journalists, and civic leaders collected testimony. In 1910, when the Chicago Vice Commission held hearings, his name came up repeatedly. Witnesses talked about a man named Colosimo, who fixed things when a house was in trouble, who could get charges dropped, who issued quiet warnings when someone's payments were late. One of the commission's most striking conclusions was that Chicago's vice industry was not simply a scattering of independent brothels. It was an organized business with layers of management above the front-of-line workers. Colosimo sat on one of those upper layers. Where a legitimate firm might have overseers, clerks, and executives, his structure had madams, collectors, and political go-betweens. Sometimes the public got a glimpse of how that machinery handled conflict. A small madam might decide she no longer wanted to pay his share. Perhaps she believed the police were looking the other way on their own, or that she had found some alternate protector. At first, the response would be a conversation. Someone from his circle would visit, sit at her kitchen table, and remind her of understandings. If that failed, there might be a raid not necessarily from honest officers, but from policemen nudged in that direction by his allies. The message was clear. Stay inside the system if you want to stay in business. In a few extreme cases, houses that resisted too stubbornly suffered more direct pressure. Windows were broken, ugly rumors spread to drive away customers, or a rival operation opened right next door with better protection. Violence in the sense of assaults and killings remained relatively rare in his heyday, not because he was squeamish, but because open bloodshed risked drawing attention that neither he nor his political partners wanted. Intimidation and economic pressure usually sufficed. His involvement with the so-called Black Hand era added another complicated layer. By the early 1900s, newspapers were full of tales about Italian extortion gangs sending threatening letters, kidnapping, even planting small bombs. Some of these stories were exaggerated or tinged with prejudice, but many were rooted in real crimes. At first, he seemed to position himself as a defender against such attacks. Merchants were told that if they aligned with him, he would see to it that no more letters arrived, or that those who sent them were spoken to. But when police dug into some of those incidents, they found connections that were hard to untangle. Were the Black Handers entirely separate from his own associates? Or were there moments when lines blurred and threats from one group conveniently increased the need for protection from the other? Direct proof was scarce. Witnesses feared retaliation. Those who did speak often contradicted one another, yet the pattern fit a broader underworld habit, creating or allowing a climate of fear, then stepping in as the only reliable shield against it. Beyond extortion and prostitution, his reach touched labor and business in smaller ways. There were hints in scattered reports that he or his lieutenants sometimes influenced union matters on street crews and in small construction firms. If a contractor wanted a project to proceed without sudden strikes or trouble, dealing with one of his men could smooth things out. That did not make him a full-fledged labor racketeer on the scale seen in later decades, but it showed how his influence seeped into various corners of city life. His cafe, opened in 1911, served as both a showcase and a headquarters. During the day, tradesmen and managers came and went through the side and back entrances. At night, bright lights and music drew the respectable crowd. Many people who dined there had, at the very least, a general idea of where part of his wealth came from. But as long as they could enjoy good food, good songs, and the thrill of proximity to power, they chose not to dwell on it. That kind of willful blindness helped him. Respectable citizens who shared a table with him were less likely to support aggressive action against his businesses. Newspaper society columns that mentioned parties at his cafe softened the harsher investigative pieces appearing elsewhere in the same papers. At times, even he seemed to believe his own cleaned-up version of the story. Friends remembered him boasting that he had brought order to an unruly district, that before men like him stepped in, the levee had been an ugly chaos of streetwalkers and thieves. In this telling, his houses were well-run places that kept trouble contained. He presented himself as a kind of organizer, even a necessary one. The record from reformers and former workers told another side. Order for the boss often meant confinement and control for those under him. Women in his houses lived under strict rules, enforced by madams whose own positions depended on satisfying him and keeping police content. Fines for minor disobedience, constant debts for clothing and lodging, and the threat of being thrown out without a reference kept many from leaving. Some did manage to escape, helped by church groups or charitable homes, and their stories occasionally found their way into printed reports. Those accounts rarely named him directly, but when investigators mapped ownership and payoffs, his name surfaced again and again. In that way, every tale of a worker trapped by economic coercion, every description of a resident too afraid to speak openly about protection money, attached itself indirectly to him. His personal style added another layer of influence. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He did not quote books or attend lectures, yet he possessed a sharp instinct for reading faces and moods. Visitors to his office said he could tell within a few minutes whether someone was trying to deceive him. He listened more than he spoke in serious meetings, weighing what each person wanted and what they feared. That ability to sense leverage points made him dangerous. At the same time, he enjoyed being liked. He spread money around in ways that made people feel grateful. He paid hospital bills for wounded associates, sent baskets at holidays, financed small businesses for relatives and friends. These acts of generosity, sincere or strategic, bound people to him. A driver who knew that his child's doctor visit had been covered by the boss was less likely to talk to outsiders if trouble arose. Notably, there is little evidence that he ever tried to distance himself from the most exploitative parts of his empire in any serious moral sense. He might have shifted public emphasis to the cafe, to music and food, but he never dismantled the brothel network that underpinned his wealth. When levee closures threatened it, he migrated operations rather than shut them down. When public outrage flared, he relied on his political allies to absorb it. By the time Prohibition arrived, and he began resisting Torrio's push toward liquor, his pattern of decision-making was set. He favored stability, controllable risk, and arrangements that had worked for him for years. That caution, which had served him well in preserving his life through earlier conflicts, now set him apart from the younger, more aggressive men rising around him. Looking at the full sweep of his activities from the safety of later years, historians drew a portrait neither entirely monstrous nor in any way admirable. He was a man shaped by poverty and discrimination who chose, at each step, to advance himself by exploiting those with even fewer choices than he had once faced. The fact that the legal and political environment made that exploitation easy did not absolve him. It simply helped explain how he could operate so long with so little interference. When his name eventually surfaced again in courtrooms and hearings decades later, it was often as a reference point. Senators and prosecutors probing organized crime spoke of the old levy days and of Colosimo as one of the first prominent Italian vice bosses in Chicago. They used his career to show that syndicate-style crime in the city did not start with bootlegging. It merely changed its main product. By then, people who had actually seen him on the streets were few. But the structure he had helped build illegal businesses feeding money into political campaigns and city offices, violence held in reserve behind a screen of respectability, a whole neighborhoods taught to look to gangsters rather than law for conflict resolution, remained painfully familiar. Years after a single shot in that back hallway dropped him to the floor, his name still surfaced in places he never saw. Courtrooms, Senate hearings, lecture halls, police academies. People who had never walked past South Wabash or watched the lights of the levee rise at night still spoke about the heavy man with the diamonds who had once called himself king. In Chicago, however, day to day life slid quickly into the new era. Torrio took hold of the reins Big Jim had dropped and steered the same machine onto a different road. Brew kettles that had once supplied legal taverns now ran after dark. Trucks that might earlier have delivered meat and grain now moved barrels. The habits Big Jim had trained into his network, regular routes, strict schedules, firm expectations about who paid what and when carried over directly. In back rooms, older men sometimes mentioned him with a shrug. They would say he had been old style, more interested in brothels and card games than in the roaring liquor profits now filling their pockets. Young toughs like Al Capone, who had barely known him, heard these stories secondhand. Of the early days when Italian racketeers were still carving out a space for themselves, when big money came mostly from controlling prostitution rather than beer, Capone in particular stepped into a world structured along paths Colosimo had helped lay down. The idea that one crew could dominate a whole section of the city's vice trade, taxing houses and saloons, instead of just running a few themselves, was now taken for granted. Big Jim had shown it was possible. Torrio and Capone expanded the concept to an entire region. Breweries, distribution, speakeasies, protection rackets on a massive scale. When shootings in the mid-1920s turned Chicago into a byword for gangster violence, reporters scrambled for background. Many of them reached back to the levee era to explain how things had evolved. Old clippings were pulled from drawers. Pieces about Black Hand letters, about vice commissions, about early raids on resorts. Again and again, the same names appeared, and among them was Colosimo's. Articles described how he had run approximately 200 resorts at his height, how he had once been labeled the czar of Chicago's underworld. They reminded readers that long before the country went dry, before armored cars and Tommy guns appeared in the streets, there had been quieter forms of organized crime, protection payments, controlled brothels, rigged elections. Bootlegging in that sense was not a beginning but a change of merchandise. Not every description was accurate. Some writers, eager for a dramatic tale, turned him into a nearly mythical villain, inventing conversations and motives. Others went the opposite way, painting him as a kind of rough-wedged patriarch who had at least kept things under control until wilder men arrived. The truth lay between those extremes. He had been ruthless when necessary, calculating always, yet he had also preferred business-like threats over chaotic gunplay. That did not make him benign. It made him a different type of predator. Police veterans who had served during his time offered small, telling memories. One recalled watching him stride through City Hall, headed to an alderman's office, as if he had every right to be there, not as a petitioner but as a partner. Another remembered raids on houses everyone knew fed money to him. Raids that came only when reformers stirred up enough anger to force a show of action. The pattern, they observed decades later, had been painfully obvious. From the Italian community came more tangled recollections. Some elders who had arrived in those years spoke of him with a kind of wary respect. To them, he had been proof that an Italian immigrant could become somebody in America, even if by crooked means. In neighborhoods where prejudice limited opportunity, a man who shook the hands of aldermen and judges, who drove fine automobiles and owned a grand restaurant, seemed to have beaten the system. Others, especially those whose families had suffered under extortion, used harsher words. They remembered shopkeepers who had scraped to meet protection payments, young men pressured into working as runners or doormen, women drawn into his houses and fenced off from other options. For them, his success represented not uplift but betrayal. A fellow immigrant who had chosen to profit from the very vulnerabilities they all shared. His 2 marriages left their own tracks in memory. Victoria, strong-willed and outspoken, lived long enough to see the Capone years. She never tired of telling anyone who asked that without her early efforts he would have remained a simple collector, another small cog in the first ward machine. When reporters sought color for stories about the old levy, she provided it freely, describing his temper, his greed, his vanity. Dale Winter, by contrast, rarely discussed him later. She returned to the stage, acted in plays, and tried to separate her artistic life from the underworld scandal that had engulfed her husband. People in theatrical circles sometimes whispered about her connection to the famous Gangster, but she focused on lines and rehearsals, not brothels and bullets. To her, he had been a complicated man who gave her gifts and a brief taste of high society, then left her a widow in a world eager to lump her with his crimes. Law enforcement circles used his career as a case study in what went wrong during the city's earlier attempts to handle vice. Training materials for new detectives in later decades sometimes included anonymous scenarios clearly based on his life. A man rises from street work into organized crime by building close ties with local politicians. Repeated small arrests fail to dent his influence. Commissions investigate but do not break the underlying systems. Recruits were asked what should have been done differently. Some argued that harsher sentencing on early extortion and morals charges might have crippled his growth. Others stressed the need for independent oversight, separated from local political machines, the kind of structure that had finally begun to appear, only much later. However they answered, the point of the exercise was clear. Allowing men like him to operate unimpeded laid the groundwork for larger, more destructive organizations. Historians dug through the paper trail he left behind. City council transcripts, vice commission reports, divorce filings, old grand jury minutes, where witnesses nervously described the levy's arrangements. Piecing those together, they reconstructed the scale of his operations with more precision than his contemporaries had managed. They estimated revenues from his houses, counting average nightly takes, multiplying by the known number of locations under his umbrella. They compared those figures with property records showing how many buildings he owned or controlled through fronts. They followed the money outward: contributions to political campaigns, loans to friendly businessmen, purchases of out-of-state real estate. The sums were staggering for that period, confirming that he had been not just a local tough, but a major economic force in the shadow city that thrived next to the official one. Those same historians also traced the social cost. Using interviews, court cases, and reform literature from the time, they calculated how many women likely passed through his network, how many families in immigrant neighborhoods had paid into his protection rackets, how many elections in certain precincts had been shaped by his influence. The picture that emerged was not simply one man's climb, but a web of damaged lives left behind. At the same time, they resisted the temptation to blame everything on him alone. Chicago in those years, they pointed out, offered men like him an almost perfect environment: rapid growth, a flood of immigrants with few protections, weak or corrupted institutions, and a cultural acceptance of tolerated vice districts, where the usual rules did not apply. Without that setting, his talents for intimidation and organization might have led only to small-time crimes. With it, he became a central figure. In the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, when televised hearings on organized crime introduced terms like syndicate and outfit to a wide audience, His name appeared again as part of the backstory. Officials explained that the modern Chicago outfit, with its corporate-like structure and reach into unions and businesses, had roots in earlier vice empires. They mentioned that before Torrio and Capone, an immigrant from Calabria had shown how to centralize prostitution and gambling on a citywide scale. Some viewers, hearing this for the first time, assumed he must have been like the more glamorous gangsters of Hollywood films. The reality, as the surviving photos and testimonies showed, was different. He was heavyset, often unsmiling in pictures, with a thick mustache and watchful eyes. He favored showy jewelry but moved with the deliberate pace of a man who knew he was safest when never rushed. He lacked the strange charisma that later made Capone a media figure. Yet in practical terms, he had been no less significant in shaping the underworld's foundations. The actual place where he fell changed over time. Colosimo's cafe went through different owners, different uses. For a while it continued as a restaurant under new management, its name altered, its connection to him gradually thinned. Later, as the city rebuilt and reconfigured, the block itself changed. New structures rose, old ones came down. Commuters and tourists walked past without realizing that the ground beneath them had once held the most famous underworld dining room in Chicago. Occasionally, a writer on local history would visit the site and imagine him there, moving from table to table, shaking hands, unaware that his own lieutenant had already begun to see him as an obstacle. Those pieces sometimes describe the present-day quiet of the street as a kind of answer to the noise and schemes that had once filled it. For students of crime, one of the lasting lessons of his story lay in the way his empire both collapsed and endured. Personally, he was gone in an instant, dropped by a single bullet in a place he thought safe. Institutionally, almost everything he had built lived on. The payment routes, the corrupt alliances, the idea that vice should be organized rather than left to scattered individuals. The men who replaced him did not need to invent those things. They only had to step into the spaces he had cleared. From time to time, old rumors about his murder resurfaced. Some claimed a confession letter existed from one of the gunmen, never released publicly. Others insisted a retired detective had privately named names before he died. None of those stories ever produced hard evidence. The official status of the case remained unchanged, unsolved. That unresolved ending suited the broader pattern. In his world, mysteries were often convenient, and many powerful people had good reasons to prefer them unsolved. Within academic circles, debates continued over how much credit or blame to give him in the evolution of organized crime. Some argued his role had been exaggerated by later tellings eager for a first boss figure. Others, pointing to the documentary record, maintained that without his early consolidation of the levee and his political bridging between Italian gangs and City Hall, Chicago's underworld would have developed very differently. What no serious student denied was that he had been a pivotal character in the city's transition from scattered vice to coordinated syndicate. His control over prostitution and gambling in the early 20th century offered a template for the later coordination of alcohol distribution, labor racketeering, and beyond. The techniques he honed, regular tribute, selective bribery, intimidation wrapped in the language of protection, echoed in every later investigation into the outfit's operations. For the everyday listener or viewer hearing this story much later, far removed from the smells and sounds of the old levee, his life can sound almost like a dark fable. A poor boy crosses an ocean, rises to power using every crack in a flawed system, surrounds himself with luxury, and is finally struck down by the very dynamics he helped create. Yet, unlike a fable, there is no neat moral at the end, no single lesson that resolves the contradictions. Instead, his story offers fragments of understanding. It shows how crime can weave itself into ordinary civic life when money is allowed to trump principle again and again. It illustrates how personal ambition, left unchecked by meaningful oversight, can turn resilience into exploitation. And it demonstrates that the end of one man, even a powerful one, does not by itself undo the damage left behind. Some nights, in certain Chicago bars where old stories still find an audience, you can hear his name spoken softly in the middle of tales about Torrio and Capone. Someone will lean over a drink and say, "You know, before those guys there was Big Jim." Then they will talk about the cafe, about the diamonds on his fingers, about the day the city woke up to headlines announcing his murder. Most of the people around them will listen for a moment, then return to their own conversations. Time moves on. Yet in the weave of the city's memory, his thread remains. a reminder that long before gangster lore filled movies and paperbacks, a real man from a stony village in Calabria walked Chicago's streets and proved, in ways both impressive and devastating, how much one determined individual could shape the hidden economy of a great American city. On quiet afternoons in modern Chicago, when the sky hangs low over the lake and the air hums with traffic, most people walking through the South Loop have no idea that they are crossing the old routes of the levee. Office towers, parking lots, and new condominiums stand where, a century ago, carriages and early automobiles brought streams of men to the doors of saloons and resorts that quietly answered to Giovanni, Big Jim Colosimo. His cafe is gone. The wallpaper has peeled, the tables were sold off, the stage pulled down. Even the replacement businesses that followed have themselves been replaced more than once. Yet if someone were to dig beneath the sidewalks, beneath the layers of asphalt and concrete, they would be standing on ground shaped by choices he helped set in motion. Today, the story of his life lives mostly in records and in the work of people who like to chase ghosts through archives. On microfilm readers and libraries, his name still flashes by in grainy headlines. Vice King indicted. Colosimo's resort raided. Cafe owner slain. City council minutes note his presence indirectly. In debates about licensing and restricted districts, court ledgers show his fines and dismissals in spare, dry lines of ink. Historians piece together his path from scattered fragments. An arrest report from the 1,890 seconds describes a young laborer involved in a street quarrel. A 1,903 clipping mentions a notorious Italian questioned about extortion letters. A 1,910 reform pamphlet lists him among those said to control houses on certain streets. Divorce papers from the late 1,910 seconds detail properties, bank accounts, and accusations of greed. A police summary from May 1,920 describes in neutral language the position of a lifeless body in a cloakroom. Laid side by side, those documents turn the rough outline of his legend into something more human and more troubling. They show how steadily he moved from sweat-stained jobs no one else wanted to the role of middleman between the poorest residents of his neighborhood and the most powerful men at City Hall. They reveal how early he learned that the city's structures could be bent for anyone willing to pay and to intimidate. Students of immigration history see his life as both typical and sharply unusual. Like hundreds of thousands of others from southern Italy, he left a rural region where land was scarce and prospects limited. He arrived in a city that needed strong backs but offered little respect. He faced prejudice, language barriers, and the daily struggle of crowded tenements and unstable work. Many in that situation formed mutual aid societies, saved money, opened small shops, sent their children to school, and gradually carved out legitimate stability. He chose a different route. He noticed how fear stalked his neighbors in the form of threatening letters and unfriendly gangs, and he decided there was money to be made by inserting himself into that fearful relationship. First as a broker, then as a controller. He turned the vulnerability of his own community into a source of personal power. For scholars of urban politics, his career illustrates how vice and government intertwined. The tolerated red light districts of the early 20th century rested on a bargain. Brothels, gambling rooms, and lady-night bars would be allowed to operate in certain areas as long as they stayed within informal rules and contributed reliably to the political machine. Colosimo proved particularly good at keeping his side of that bargain. The envelopes he passed to ward offices and station houses bought him protection that many legitimate businesses never enjoyed. At the same time, his story cannot be told without the people who fought against everything he represented. Ministers walked the streets of the levee handing out religious tracts and offers of shelter to women eager to leave. Settlement house workers taught English classes by day and testified in hearings by night. The Chicago Vice Commission, for all its limitations and moralizing language, forced the city to look at the exploitation behind the glitter. Ironically, these reform efforts helped to define his public image more sharply than his own publicity ever did. Their reports named him, described the structure of his enterprises, and laid out the connections between brothel profits and political campaigns. Without those investigations, much of what we now know about his business methods would have vanished along with the buildings. When those reports led to the closure of the official levee district, they did not destroy his livelihood, but they did scatter it. Houses moved to quieter streets. Former madams reopened under new names. He and his lieutenants adjusted routes, redrew their private maps, found new officers to pay. In this way, attempts to shut him down instead showed how flexible his organization had become. It could survive pressure by dispersing, an ability later bootleggers and racketeers would also rely on. Criminologists studying the evolution of organized crime often stop at his name when tracing a line from neighborhood gangs to syndicates that behave like corporations. Before men like him, vice in many cities tended to be fragmented. Individual saloon keepers, independent madams, small gambling operators each made their own arrangements. He helped knit those fragments into a unified structure, at least on the south side, where tribute and decisions flowed through a central figure. That structure, in turn, influenced the language investigators would later use. Terms like vice trust and syndicate first appeared in print while he was still alive. By the time federal agents in later decades used words like outfit and family to describe organized crime groups, they were building on concepts that had evolved in response to figures such as him. In personal recollections collected long after his death, small details about his character emerge between heavier facts. A musician who played at the cafe remembered that Big Jim loved sentimental songs from the old country, and would sometimes insist on hearing them twice. A former driver recalled how he hated the cold and wore heavy coats, even in mild weather. A waiter described how he could switch from charm to menace in an instant if a guest said something that struck him as disrespectful. None of these glimpses soften the reality of what he did, but they remind us that he was not a cardboard villain. He had tastes, habits, insecurities, and occasional flashes of humor. Like many powerful people in dubious trades, he could be warm to those directly around him, while being completely indifferent to the suffering built into his business model. Over time, popular storytelling about gangsters blurred lines between him and those who followed. Films and novels often compress timelines, merging early vice bosses into one composite figure. A heavy man in a suit, moving through a nightclub with a flower in his lapel, might owe as much to Big Jim as to any later bootlegger, yet the script gives him a different name. The broad strokes immigrant roots, rise through vice, flashy restaurant, sudden hit fit easily into archetype. Serious biographers tried to pull him back out of that blur. They located old census entries showing his household growing wealthier over time. They tracked his moves from one address to another as he climbed the social ladder. They compared conflicting newspaper reports to identify which incidents were confirmed and which were likely rumor. The picture they drew was more restrained than the lurid tales, but no less compelling. In those studies, clear patterns emerge in his behavior. He tested institutions constantly, pushing until he met resistance, then adjusting just enough to keep moving. If small bribes no longer sufficed to keep raids away, he found higher officials to approach. If a court case threatened to expose too much, key witnesses somehow melted from view or remembered less than they had first claimed. Each successful evasion taught him that the system could be managed if one understood its pressure points. That lesson, more than any one gunfight or spectacular scandal, might be his most enduring contribution to the criminal world. He showed that under certain conditions, a man who understood how to work both crime and politics could operate almost like a public figure and a hidden ruler at the same time. For citizens and officials wrestling with corruption long after his era, his story serves as a warning about what happens when economic desperation, political machines, and weak oversight combine. It demonstrates how quickly the promise of a new life in a big city can be twisted into justification for preying on the very people who share that background. It also underlines how hard it is to uproot such systems once they are entangled with legitimate power. Still, it would be wrong to treat him as an all-powerful mastermind. He was, in the end, also a man of his moment, bound by the limits of his education, his neighborhood ties, and his fears. His refusal to embrace the opportunities of prohibition, his insistence that the old ways were enough, showed that even shrewd criminals can misread the future. He built a structure strong enough to outlast him, but he could not foresee how thoroughly others would transform it once he was gone. If he could somehow walk those streets today, he would not recognize much. The brothels are gone from those particular blocks, though exploitation has not vanished from the world. The smoky saloons have been replaced by glass-front cafes and office lobbies. The aldermen no longer operate quite so openly as brokers of vice, though debates about campaign finance and influence still echo the old questions in new language. He would likely be surprised, too, to learn that his name has survived at all, when so many of his associates are forgotten. Part of that endurance comes from timing. He stood at the hinge between two eras, the closing of the old vice districts, and the opening of the Prohibition decade. That position made him interesting to later generations trying to understand how Chicago's underworld could grow so quickly into something that challenged even national law enforcement. In the broad sweep of history, he will never be as famous as Al Capone, nor as heavily studied as the great political bosses of his day. Yet anyone who looks closely at how organized crime in Chicago took shape eventually finds him near the beginning of the chain, standing in smoky doorways of the levee, counting receipts in the back of his cafe, shaking hands in the corridors of city offices. From a stony hillside village in Calabria to a gilded restaurant in a booming American city, from anonymous laborer to a man whose death made front pages across the country, his journey mirrors both the possibilities and the perils of that age. He proved that drive and cunning could indeed overcome class and prejudice, but he also showed how easily those same traits, unchecked by conscience or law, could hollow out the integrity of a community. In the end, his legacy is not a single building or a single notorious night, but a pattern, a demonstration of how vice can be organized on a large scale, how it can plug itself into legitimate institutions, and how hard societies must work if they hope to prevent such figures from rising again in new forms. The story of Big Jim Colosimo is therefore not only about one man and his crimes, it is also a story about a city learning, painfully and slowly, what happens when it tolerates corruption as the price of prosperity. His life and death remain on the record as both a chapter in the history of organized crime and a long cautionary note about what can grow in the spaces where law, opportunity, and human ambition meet and go unexamined. And with that, we bring tonight's chapter of the Silent Empires to a gentle close. Big Jim Colosimo here, thanking you for joining me through the glamour, the influence, and the quiet rise that shaped Chicago's early underworld. If this story helped you relax or drift into sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more tales of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the calm of the night settle softly around you, and may the echoes of history guide you gently into rest. Good night.